Hired at the prison, and I worked at Jackson Prison. I got hired at it was called Northside at the time. Back in the day, before the early '80s or before the '80s, Jackson Prison was the world's largest walled prison, which means that there was no fences around it. It was just all block. It was just all block. You know what I'm saying?
That's
So
nice.
so there was no prison. Let me find this picture that I keep up all the time.
And this was your first. This is your
Well-
being. Were you super like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be a prison guard, or were you kind of like, they're not ready for me, or maybe in between?
Well, you know, when you're going through these classes, the ones through LCC,
Yeah.
they kind of take you on a tour. In the very first tour they took me on, was a tour of Jackson Prison. It was called Central at the time, and that was like where a lot of lifers and stuff were. And I'm thinking, you know, these guys are locked up all the time, and you know, we're not going to be around them and stuff. But they take a group of us 12 young kids in there, and those guys were like popping their doors open, stepping out on the galleries, cat whistling the girls,
they
and
can
some
just go out
guys,
there.
you know. But yeah, so yeah, they had a way. We called them door plugs, so they had a way that they could keep their doors open if they wanted to. They just put a little piece of wood in there or something. It wouldn't shut all the way. If you didn't go around pinching doors while you're making rounds, you'd find doors that could open. So yeah, a lot of these guys just stepped out the first, you know, and then there was a bunch of them walking around on, you know, on the base gallery or whatever. So I was like, holy crap, this is what I'm getting into. I think we lost probably 3 people that night.
Oh yeah.
3 people that didn't come back.
I thought you meant.
Were there any?
No, we didn't. Nobody died that
I was
night.
like, wow.
We
Oh,
lost
yeah, we
3
lost them all. They
people.
never came back
The
out.
prisoners
And I
came
still
up
went back. Yeah, no.
And you're like,
no,
this
I
is
mean, I'm
fun.
talking
I'll do this
about.
for the next 30 years.
Yeah. No, they just didn't come back to classes. They
Gotcha.
decided.
Which is a lot better.
Yeah. So if you look at this picture, this was Jackson Prison.
That's
This is the
pretty big.
world's largest walled prison
Oh,
at the
wow.
time, and this was before the 80s. And what they did was there was over 5,000 or something like that prisoners in this area with one administration. Well, they started having like riots, and you know, the prisoners were starting to be uncontrolled, you know, because there was too many prisoners and not enough staff and stuff. So they what they did is they put a fence around the north side, and they called that north side. And they put a fence around the south side, and they called that south side.
Very creative.
So when I started, in 1989, they had this completed, the breakdown completed. So there was north side, central, and south side. South side was a trustee division, the lowest division. North side was still kind of a level 4, level 3, which is one step below the level 5.
What is the highest level?
5 is the maximum facility. So if you're at a level 5 facility, you're locked up 23 hours a day.
Holy cow.
Yeah, you only get like 1 hour, and that's all chained up. You don't come out without
Oh my gosh.
any leg irons or chains.
So that's like if
There's
you've
always
done-
prisoners.
Is that
yeah,
like-
that's if you screw up while you're in prison at a level 4.
Okay.
Okay.
So nobody gets sentenced to level 5. You know what I'm saying?
Is it more like a punishment for people in level 4, or?
Basically,
Okay.
or even 2. I mean, you could be,
Oh, okay.
you could go from a level 2 to a level 5. Depends on what you do. I mean, if you stab somebody in prison, you're going to end up in level 5 for a while. If you beat up a guard, you might end up in, not always, but sometimes you end up in level 5. But the level 4 is one step below that. So the guys in level 4, they have more freedom. So there was two officers and 350 prisoners in the units that I was working at a level 4 prison. So, you know, those guys were still lifers. They were still murderers, serial killers, all that kind of stuff. But they just hadn't stepped up to the level 5 position yet. And some of them don't, you know. Some people come in there and they do good time. So they don't end up at level 5. But, you know, we do deal with the ones that end up in level 5.
And you were with all 5 levels? Like you would be like,
I never worked in a level 5 prison.
Okay, you didn't.
I worked in the level 4. Yeah, back in the day, back in 1989. Back in the day,
I hate those back
I
in
was
the
a
day.
badass. I used to kick everybody's ass in prison. No, I did not. No, that's not the way you go into it. So walk you through. So when I first started at 22 years old, in '89. The Department of Corrections was hiring a bunch of people at the time. They had gotten money or people were retiring. Anyways, there was a ton of people getting hired. So there was a bunch of us fresh into the prison. Even at the facility I was at, there was a bunch of us youngsters that would go in there. I would start at let me get this right. I'd start at 5:56 in the morning,
Oh,
Wow.
and I'd get out at 2.
why would
Why
the
5:56? Yeah.
Why 5:56? Because we have to have a roll call
Oh,
before we
Why
go
at
out and do shift.
5:56?
Because a shift change is at 6 o'clock.
oh, so roll
So
call.
I have to do roll call to find out what happened the shift before, and they check us all out to make sure that we're all sober and supposed to, dress like we're supposed to dress and all that kind of stuff. And then they send us on our way, and then we relieve the third shift that gets to wake up and leave. Sorry, third shift.
The third shift, I'm guessing the hours were just crazy. Did you ever work at third?
I did not like third shift. No. The only reason I'm saying that is because a lot of people are sleeping on third shift. I mean, prisoners. There's not a lot of activity
Yeah.
on third shift, so the officers get to.
Is that nice or is that
It was for some of them. It was never. That's never.
more boring for you?
Yeah, it was more boring for me.
Okay.
Like I said, I was 22 years old. I
Yeah.
wanted to.
And you had a really good relationship, you'd say. I mean, not good relationship, but I meant to say you were good with the prisoners. Like you knew how to talk to them.
Yeah, I
And it
could.
wasn't
Most of the time, yeah, most of the
wasn't
time,
like-
I could de-escalate situations pretty easily. So that was me. It's just like here's what I tell people. 80% of my career was just like this. Just me sitting around kicking it with guys, learning about what they did or how they did it, or learning, all their behaviors and stuff like that. Just kicking it. 20% sucked. Of that 10%, or 10% of that 20%, I never want to see again or talk about. I mean,
Just
I do,
heard awful things.
yeah, I do talk about it sometimes, but it's just stuff that
Really,
when I'm
like,
telling my
dark.
prison stories, I don't really get into, people dropping off Fourth Gallery and laying next to me and splatting all over me
Holy
and stuff.
cow.
That's not something that you
Oh,
want to
yeah,
do on a daily basis.
Yeah, no.
It's get a shovel and scoop somebody up, throw them in a bag and send them on their way.
And that just kind of
That happens.
I kind of interrupted your day by day.
Right.
So you're at roll call. Is it the sense of fear or is it kind of like just another?
Well, you know what the good thing about me was, and I tell people this all the time, is I lived in Charlotte, and it was actually 50 miles from my door to the prison door. So I had 50 miles to de-escalate myself. So if I had a bad night or a bad morning with my wife and kids, I had that time to think about, them things and get that out of my mind before I walked through the gates. You never want to go in with a bad attitude because that just causes problems. So I changed myself in that 50-mile drive. I changed myself from my personal life to my prison life.
Gotcha.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
On the way home, if I had a bad day at work, if I seen stuff that I didn't want to see, if I had to deal with stuff I didn't want to deal with, I had 50 miles to de-escalate myself. And so when I got home, I left work there. And you know what I'm saying, vice versa.
100%.
So my wife and kids didn't hear a lot of my stories growing up until I'd have like poker parties at the house or something, and all the guys would show up and they're like, "Hey, remember the time we did this and that?" And my wife, they'd leave and she'd be like, "You never told me about that." I'm like, "Yeah, I just didn't talk about that kind of stuff."
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I bet that's hard to
So-
talk about with your family.
So I did my roll call at 6:52 or whatever it was. I think it's 7-8 minutes before our shift change, and then walked through the gates and walked across the yard. And my when I worked in housing most of my career as a corrections officer.
Gotcha.
So I'd walk to a housing unit, and it was the big 4-story brick building with cells that were 4 stories high. There was like 100 and I think there was 76 on each side, and then we ended up double bunking too. So we had a ton of prisoners in there with two officers.
Oh, it's 2?
Yeah, 2 officers, and it was just the housing unit. So we dealt with most of the time it was like a bid job. So I dealt with the same prisoners on a daily basis. So I got
Yeah,
to know them.
there's still the troublemakers.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Like in
knew
every
who-
society.
I knew
it's
who
like-
was running the block, and and who I could use to help me.
Oh yeah,
run the
like
block,
hey, I know you.
Yeah.